are often described as being pleasant and dissonant as being unpleasant. That's quite a sort of valenced or aesthetic type of characterization of consonance and dissonance. An alternative is to describe consonant intervals as being stable and dissonant as being unstable. This is much more of a sort of functional definition. And it certainly seems that in music, this is the way that composers and musicians actually use consonance and dissonance. They use dissonance to build up tension and consonance to release that tension. And it's through this interchange of consonance and dissonance that you can create in Western music this sense of directed motion. Now, it's been noted for millennia that consonant intervals, or those that are typically deemed consonant, frequently approximate low integer frequency ratios, which led to the sort of natural ancient understanding of these things being related to abstract numerical universal truths. But a more contemporary psychoacoustic approach notes that if you are working with harmonic complex tones, these are the type of tones that are produced by the human voice and most musical instruments, such as plucking a string or blowing a reed instrument, they all produce harmonic complex tones, that there are at least 3 spectral features that have local maxima or minima at low integer frequency ratios. So those are roughness. This is a fairly familiar notion, but if you have a chord, a bunch of tones all played at the same time, and if they have a number of frequency components that are close together, they will not be separately resolved by the auditory system, and they will beat. And this rapid beating or fluctuation in loudness is considered to be perceived to be unpleasant. Another one is harmonicity. To what extent does the spectrum that's produced by all of the tones you're playing at the same time, to what extent does it actually approximate the spectrum that would be produced by a single tone? So if it approximates it well, then perhaps that sound is in some sense simpler. It's easier to resolve its fundamental pitch. Also, it better approximates the sound of the human voice, which is perhaps one of the most important sounds that we are attuned to. Another one is spectral entropy, which is essentially just a measure of the complexity of the spectrum. So if you have a bunch of tones sounding at the same time and they have a number of partials at essentially the same or very similar frequencies, then this will have a lower complexity, a lower entropy, than when you have a bunch of tones whose frequency components do not overlap. And in recent experiments, we have found that these 3 features generalize well to unfamiliar microtonal chords, at least for Western listeners. But, of course, there are likely to be cultural origins as well, or instead of, indeed. Perhaps the 2 most obvious of those are familiarity and association. So given exposure to, for example, Western music, we clearly tend to hear more of these so-called consonant intervals and consonant chords. We hear those much more than we hear the dissonant chords. So they are just more familiar, and it's actually that gives rise to their consonants. Similarly, we would typically, if we're listening to Western music, we will hear certain chords commonly used at the ends of phrases. For example, major chords and minor chords. We're far less likely to hear something that is considered to be dissonant, like a semitone cluster or something at the end of a phrase. That would be very unusual. And it's likely, of course, that these possibly universal psychoacoustic or spectral features can coexist with these cultural features, and that there are causal relationships between them, which can be quite complex. But in order to actually clearly demonstrate that any of these intrinsic psychoacoustic spectral type features do play a universal role, the only way to do that is to conduct experiments in communities that have no prior exposure to Western music, or at least in the case of something like this particular question, have no experience to musical harmony. Now, the most important recent piece of work related to this is McDermott et al.'s 2016 study, where they travelled to a very remote community in Bolivia who have minimal exposure to Western music. And they found with this community that pleasantness ratings were not actually predicted by traditional Western music theoretical characterizations of consonance and dissonance. They found that they preferred more widely spaced chords. They also found that they did not rate, this is single tones with harmonic partials, complex harmonic tones were not rated higher than tones where some of those partials were detuned to make them inharmonic. So that seems to provide fairly strong evidence that harmonicity does not play a role for this community. Interestingly, they found that they did respond negatively to the roughness of pure tone intervals. But interestingly, this did not seem to be obviously evident in their responses to the musically presented intervals and chords. Okay, I will come back to this later. Okay, so in our study, we went to a remote community in Papua New Guinea. So this was our starting place, Sydney, where I'm talking from now, and this was our destination. And we were travelling to sort of the northeastern part of Papua New Guinea. I'll just zoom in now just to give an overview of what the landscape is like. So this is the Urawa River, travelling down here. And this is a very steep valley, and it's very mountainous and very lush and green. Many of the slopes are practically vertical. So this was the plane that we commissioned to get us to the location, and essentially the airstrip is really just a long field, and you can see behind the plane some of the slopes there, which are, as I've mentioned, practically vertical. So fortunately there was a crowd waiting for us who helped us with our heavy luggage to the village where we were staying, which was a pretty considerable and exhausting hike. So it was an extraordinarily beautiful place, and there were amazing and fascinating people to meet. So let me just try to give you a very brief flavour of that by going through some photographs, and also the music playing in the background is some of the local indigenous music that we recorded while we were there. So it's a cloud forest region, which essentially means it's a very lush rainforest. Every afternoon, or almost every afternoon, clouds descend onto the village because we're very high up here in the mountains, and it's very wet. This is a lady with her dog. This is a descendant of one of the hunting dogs, which would have been common perhaps sort of 50 years ago and used for hunting, although hunting no longer takes place in this particular village where we were, Towit, for religious reasons. This is one of the performers in the piece you're hearing now, playing the kundu drum and singing. This is the hut where we ate every evening. So typically most of the huts have got a fire in the centre where they cook the food, mostly vegetarian food, mostly roots based, and the smoke just goes out of the roof. As you can see here, so that's one of the traditional huts built with bamboo and leaves. These are the performers that you're listening to now. And here we are going through a training process with the research assistants, explaining how to use the computers and how to go through the experiment. And here we have Namashurung actually conducting the experiment with one of our willing participants. And after we left, our three research assistants then went on to a number of the other villages to collect more data from other participants, enabling us to get a wider range of musical backgrounds. So Essentially, we can class our participants in this broader region into three categories by their level or type of musical exposure. So the entire area has been missionized for quite some time. The village where we were staying in Towit is an SDA, that's a Seventh-day Adventist village. And there was one other village with an SDA church. Now these are generally regular church attendees, and they will sing essentially Western hymns. Well, they are Western hymns, which are predominantly in a major key. They comprise mostly major harmony. There are a few minor chords and a very small number of diminished, augmented and suspended type chords. The other group are Lutheran villages and the church attendees of those. So in the Lutheran church services, we'll typically have either Western or indigenous melodies accompanied by Western-like guitar music played on guitars or acoustic guitars or ukuleles in what's known as the string band style, which is tok pidgin for string band, tok pidgin being the lingua franca in Papua New Guinea. They will also have exposure to indigenous music, which is somewhat frowned upon in the SDA villages. Finally, we have perhaps the most interesting group, which are non-attenders of church. These people do not go to church. Most of these ostensibly are Lutherans, but live in a community that does not have access to a church that is actually even feasible to get to. They have limited exposure to Western-like music. They will have exposure to the indigenous music. So just briefly, with regard to the indigenous music, this is essentially monophonic music. It has no chords at all. It's sung, often accompanied by a kundu drum, which is a long tubular drum, and typically covers a fairly small pitch range. The intervals used within it do not obviously correspond to Western musical intervals. So this is based on analyses of some recordings we have of this music. Okay, so in Sydney we repeated exactly the same experiment, and here we have two cohorts once again who differ by their musical exposure. So first up we have the classic first year psychology students cohort, and given that they come from Western Sydney, they have a relatively multicultural heritage, with the heritage going back to the Middle East often, to Asia, but also Anglo and Australian heritage, but a good mixture. All of them, well, except for one participant out of the total of 60, listen on a regular basis to Western music, mostly pop and rock. The Sydney musicians were classified as those having at least 5 years training or equivalent experience. They were recruited separately. Obviously, due to their interest and their profession, they are well versed in Western music. So the actual design of each trial takes the following form, and intervals were tested in one block and chords in a different block. But essentially, the first thing the participant would hear in each trial is the word inguk, which means one in Nungon. Then they would hear chord 1. Then they would hear chord 2. Then they hear the word yay, which means 2. And then they would hear exactly the same sequence of chords, but flipped in reverse. So they would hear chord 2 and then chord 1. Then they would ask the question, which of these two pieces of music is finished, to which they would respond inguk or yay. So to give an idea of what the intervals and chords were, there were 72 different ordered pairs of all 12 pitch interval classes. Some of these were wider than an octave, some of them narrower than an octave. The widest interval was 15 semitones and the narrowest was 0 semitones at unison. There were up to 4 transitions for these sequences, and they were played in 2 different timbres, 2 members of a string quartet or a 2-part choir, these coming from high quality samples. With regard to the chords, there were 42 different ordered pairs of 7 different triad classes, and those triad classes include a major chord, a minor chord, an augmented chord, a semitone cluster, a three-tone subset of a dominant seventh chord, a three-tone subset of a half diminished chord, and another chord which doesn't have an obvious name but comprises a minor third and a perfect fourth. So you could spell it out as C, E flat, and F. So each of these ordered pairs was presented in two voicings, an open voicing and a closed voicing, and in three transpositions, and in two timbres, string quartet or four-part choir again, using the same samples. So each participant did not hear all 72 intervals and all 42 sequences of triads. They heard a subset of those, and most of these changes, such as voicing, transposition and timbre, happen between participants. Okay, so to make that a little bit more concrete, let me play some examples. So this is one of the interval trials.
Inguk. Yui.
So in an example like that, we would expect a Western listener to choose the second example as being the finished one. And here is one of the chord trials.
Inguk. Yui.
And here we would expect our Western participants to choose the first one, as indeed most of them did. So that's a fairly extreme example where we're transitioning between a semitone cluster and a major chord. To analyse the resulting data, we used a multi-level Bayesian logistic regression to predict the probability that the second sequence is the one that's chosen as being finished, according to the difference between the two chords' roughnesses, harmonicities, spectral entropies, and mean pitches. So the roughnesses, harmonicities, and spectral entropies were calculated directly from the audio files. The mean pitch, in terms of the way that we actually designed the stimuli, was minimized as much as possible. In other words, as we went from any interval to another interval, we made the mean pitch of those two as close as possible. So we did not expect mean pitch to actually play a role in this experiment, as it has done in some of our other experiments with microtonal stimuli. And indeed, in the model, its effect size is not worth reporting, but we leave it in there as a control. Furthermore, we tested every subset of these four predictors and compared them with cross-validation, and this led to spectral entropy being removed from the model, because including spectral entropy resulted in poorer out-of-sample predictions than including spectral entropy. So we end up with a slightly simpler model, which has got roughness, harmonicity, and mean pitch, the first two being the key predictors of interest here. Okay, so here are the results. First of all, let's focus on the plot here on the right. So we have our minimal exposure group here, SDA group here, the Lutheran group here, we have our Sydney non-musicians here, and our Sydney musicians here. On the left column, we have the impact of roughness on the probabilities, or the difference in roughnesses between the two chords on the probability of choosing a chord, and on the right we have the impact of the difference in their harmonicities. Okay, so let's look at roughness first of all, and perhaps focus first of all on our Sydney musicians. Well, perhaps unsurprisingly, we're getting a very strong effect here. It's essentially sort of decisive when we have a large difference in the roughness. The chord or interval with that ends with the lower roughness is the one that is chosen with, almost practically 100% probability when the difference is large. Still a very strong effect for the non-musicians, but crucially and interestingly, there is still a negative trend for all of the PNG participants, in particular in the minimal exposure group. So let's just look at the evidence ratios, which are the odds of the effect of roughness being negative, which is the expected direction. So clearly it's very strong evidence for the two Sydney groups, but we actually have pretty decent evidence for the three SDA groups. And in terms of posterior probabilities, that's 0.95 for the minimal group, 0.99 for the SDA group, and 0.93. Not quite so strong, but it's still fairly convincing for that group. On the other hand, if we look at the harmonicity, the effect of harmonicity, yeah, maybe there's a hint of something positive going on here in the musician group, but actually it's highly variable. There's a lot of uncertainty here. And indeed, if we look at the evidence ratio, it's not really anything worthy of reporting. And in fact, we don't find evidence for an effect of harmonicity in any of the groups. None of the evidence ratios are above 10. So, in summary, higher roughness is associated with a lower probability of saying a chord or interval is finished. Crucially, in every PNG group, including the group with minimal exposure to Western music. There is no evidence for an effect of harmonicity in any group, even the Sydney musicians. Having said that, a test for the effect being practically equivalent to 0 also does not come up, so we cannot discount any such effect of harmonicity. Another thing that we can certainly note is that the effect of roughness is much stronger in the Sydney participants than it is in the PNG participants, and in particular in the musician group. So, in summary, the effect of roughness on stability appears to be mediated by both an intrinsic mechanism that is independent of music cultural knowledge and also an extrinsic mechanism, probably familiarity, that is dependent on Western music cultural knowledge. So the latter finding is perhaps unsurprising. We're all very much aware of the importance of prior exposure to the way that we respond to music. But does the former finding contradict those of McDermott's with the Bolivian community? It's interesting to note that they found an effect of roughness in the Bolivian community with pure tone stimuli, and this is comparing diotic, same ear, and dichotic different ear presentations of the pure tones. But this was not evidence in their responses to the actual musical examples. And they also had similar results for Western participants in an earlier paper. But this is actually somewhat analogous to our findings as well, because when we look at the intervals or chord classes, there are no obvious patterns in the PNG data. At least they do not obviously correspond to conventional characterizations of the dissonance and consonance of intervals or the chords. But when we directly measure the roughness of each of the audio signals that they listen to, there is indeed an effect, as was just shown. So how can this be explained? Well, the roughnesses of any given realization of a set of musical intervals or chords may not correlate that well with those that are obtained from a set of idealized tones, i.e. where all of the tones have exactly the same spectrum, such as are usually used to produce the sort of nice graphs that we often see. So here's a plot of roughness for intervals varying from unison, 1 octave, 2 octaves. Both the tones in this are exactly the same in terms of their spectrum across these pitch ranges, and we get all these lovely sort of minima at the perfect 12th, the octave, perfect 5th, perfect 4th, major 3rd, and so forth. But in a sort of real world scenario where every different realization of each different musical interval is sounded slightly differently, the timbre, the spectrum changes between them, it may not actually correspond particularly well with this type of graph. But crucially, under expectation, in other words, averaged over many such realizations, it will begin to correspond to this type of idealized representation. Now, interestingly, if we substitute our audio measure of harmonicity extracted directly from the acoustic signal, with an idealized version which is generated by the same intervals or same chords as the one we use, but this time realized with exactly the same harmonic complex tone, then we find that harmonicity, this idealized version of harmonicity, actually becomes a very powerful predictor for the Western listeners, for the Sydney participants, not for the PNG participants, but for the Sydney participants. So like McDermott's 2010, this strongly suggests that any impact of harmonicity is actually due to cultural learning of common musical chords. Okay, so to conclude, we have strong evidence that the effect of roughness on stability is a musical universal. And to generalize this a little bit more broadly, in a way that may be relevant for other people's work, I think this research really highlights the importance of multicultural testing, because the difference between Western and non-Western experiences of music are huge. Furthermore, if we want to uncover some of the underlying mechanisms, we really have to be going cross-culturally. Another important point to make is that the effect sizes that we're looking at here for roughness in this case they're pretty small. So that means that we have to have experiments that are designed to have sufficient power to detect small effect sizes. And finally, perhaps a little bit more narrow again, it's crucial that we use the right types of predictors for the right community. So for a community that does not have deep and regular knowledge of Western harmony, it simply doesn't make sense to use idealized representations which sort of really rely on the participants having an understanding of what these things are like on average, rather than in a particular realization. So when we're working with these communities that have limited exposure or no exposure, we have to use predictors that are calculated directly from the audio signal that they're actually hearing. Okay, so I would like to make a few acknowledgements to my co-authors, colleagues, fellow travellers and facilitators. I'll particularly highlight here Elena Smith, who was my PhD student as we made this trip and is now a doctor, so that's fantastic. And Hannah Sarvasi, who is the person who essentially organised this trip. She has a long relationship with the Noongar speakers and is the only Westerner who speaks that language fluently. I would like to thank our funders, in particular the Australian Research Council, and our research assistants in Towett, in particular Namush Urung, who unfortunately passed away recently. I would also like to thank the organisers in Towett of the research fair of which this was a part. And I will end with the references, and very pleased and happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Andy, for that presentation. That was really interesting. At the bottom of your screen, you should have an option to come up on the stage here as well so that you can answer some questions. I know that we have a lot of people who are interested in cross-cultural music perception and response to music at this conference, so I'm sure that will have been very interesting. There was an initial question from John McBride about pitch range. I don't know whether you would like to enlarge on that question, John. We can give you the option to come on the stage and actually explain your question a little bit more if you'd like to. Do you have anything to say about pitch range?
Oh, is this working?
There's John.
Yeah, it was only a minor comment. Just you look at mean pitch, you also look at pitch range.
Yeah, so pitch range is certainly something that we could include in the model, and I haven't done that so far, and I think that would be an interesting thing to investigate. But as I said, we minimise the pitch differences, the mean pitch difference between the successive stimuli, and the pitch ranges were generally fairly small in terms of like the voice leading between the two calls was generally as small as it could be. But certainly there's variation in that, and that might be interesting to look at. Having said that, I think that there would be some correlation with roughness, because something that comes through with the roughness measure is that, generally speaking, the more distant or the more open the voicing, the lower the roughness.
Sandra, we can't hear you. Maybe you can unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry. Right, that's probably going to be another theme of this conference. There was a question there from Pat Savage, who has asked, I'm curious, why ask about being finished rather than pleasant, which I believe was the measure McDermott et al. Used. I realise they may both be hard to translate, but pleasantness seems like the more common, natural way to investigate this question. And I noticed that there were a couple of other people who were also interested in that thought as well, Andy.
Okay, well, I mean, there's a number of issues here. I'm getting quite a bad echo. Which is making, okay, I'll try to talk over my own echo, which is can be challenging sometimes. So first of all, we didn't actually want to consciously replicate what McDermott et al. Actually did. Furthermore, I don't think that characterizing consonants by the term pleasant versus unpleasant is any more natural than characterizing it in terms of stability and instability, which is actually really, when it comes down to it, the way that the term is actually understood in music theory. Also, there is a kind of the practical question of what you can actually ask our participants. So in the Noongar language, there were kind of like two candidates really for the question we could ask. And one of them is the word imbangi, which means beautiful. So you're essentially asking, is the stimulus that you're hearing, which is the beautiful one? The other option was something which was much more related to the stability question, which is the buratak, which relates to whether or not something is finished. So those were really the only two words that kind of mapped to the traditional notions of consonance and dissonance that we could use in their language. And, you know, for a number of reasons, including the fact that I think asking such an aesthetically loaded question as like whether or not something is beautiful, I think that's kind of challenging, really, to know whether or not you're going to get sensible responses. Whereas I think focusing on something like stability, which has less of this sort of aesthetic or emotional quality to it, allowed us to really see how they were perceiving these sounds. Of course, it would be very interesting to go back and run the same set of experiments asking them the beautiful question, but, you know.
There's a comment there as well from Imre Ladelma, sharing with us a research report about consonance and dissonance perception in line with your roughness findings from UK and Northwest Pakistan. So there's a link there if people are interested in having a look at that.
Yeah, thanks, Imre, because I saw that paper coming up in my notifications, and it was only a few days ago it came out, wasn't it? And I haven't had time to read it yet, but it looks really interesting.
A question from Benjamin Himple. He says there is a strong correlation between harmonicity and roughness for 1-2 TET. Has this issue been addressed, for example, by also using slightly mistuned intervals or triads in order to increase roughness while keeping the harmonicity, or using dichotic diotic representation? Different same years. Sorry.
Yeah, so in terms of the stimuli that we actually used, the correlation between roughness and harmonicity when we were using the audio-derived measures of these was actually very low. I think it was about 0.1 or something, so really nothing to worry about at all. As soon as we move to these sort of idealized measures, where you're essentially generating the roughness values and the harmonicity values with constant set of harmonic complex tones, then yes, the correlation becomes much more problematic.
And Ronnie Granot says, were there differences when using 4-part choir?
So differences between whether they were listening to the string timbre versus the 4-part choir. Okay, so we Elena Smith, who will be giving a talk later, who is looking at the effect on valence of major harmony and minor harmony, and also major melodies versus minor melodies. There was no obvious effect of timbre at all. It's not something I've specifically analysed yet in these data, but that's a forthcoming analysis. So yeah, wait and see.
Kai Seidenberg, apologies for mispronouncing all these names, would like to know how roughness was computed.
Okay, so I use my own routine for extracting the peaks from the audio spectrum and then feeding those through basically Satharis roughness calculation routine. So in many respects, it's probably quite similar to the way that MIR Toolbox calculates roughness. And in fact, I double checked all of the roughness calculations with the MIR Toolbox roughness, and the model results were pretty much the same.
Great, thank you. And Manuel Anglada Tort asks, have you considered the option that the non-sing results may indicate that participants did not understand the task?
I don't think I understand the question.
Well, Manuel could perhaps join us on the stage and ask his question personally if he'd like. While we're waiting for that to happen, I might ask Richard's question. Richard Parncut says, did you think of a parallel experiment in which Australian listeners who have never heard Indigenous PNG music are tested to find out if they are sensitive to perceptual or theoretic aspects that PNG musicians consider important?
Yeah, I mean, that would be a great experiment to do. I mean, one issue is that we had when we were over there, so I'm getting quite a bad echo, is that what it's like whenever you're doing research, there's a very limited time. So we had originally had a lovely plan of going out there and recording all sorts of examples of traditional Indigenous music with different emotional connotations so that we could do that kind of balanced experiment back here. Unfortunately, that just didn't eventuate. Maybe if we get another trip there, that's the type of thing we can do. But yeah, unfortunately, not possible at the moment.
So Manuel, would you like to ask us your question? We don't seem to be able to hear you. I think he might be coming back. There's a question here from Ritas, who says, what about so-called Schwebungsdiaphony cultures? Probably pronounced that completely wrong, based on dissonances from the Western point of view.
So Ritas, are you talking about the sort of those small intervals commonly found in vocal harmony in Lithuania? Is that what is meant? Assuming so, then yes, I think that's fascinating. And I think maybe this kind of highlights, I mean, I don't know enough about that music, but maybe this highlights that there is actually a difference in terms of asking people about pleasantness of intervals compared to asking about the stability of intervals. I mean, the simple fact of the matter is that I really like the sound of semitone clusters, but they're very highly dissonant.
Going back to Manuel's question, it seems that he may have intended to say non-significant. So apologies that I didn't pick that up, Manuel. So he's asking about whether or not,
yeah, kind of obvious naysay. So in terms of the roughness, we're getting. I don't want to use the term significant because I'm in a Bayesian context, but we're getting strong evidence for every single group. I kind of feel, if we were getting similar effect sizes for harmonicity, then we should have seen that coming through as well. There's no reason for it not to. In other words, the experiment was powerful enough to detect relatively small effects. but also at the same time, as I've already mentioned, if we substitute that sort of audio-based measure of harmonicity with a more idealized version, then harmonicity does indeed come through as a very strong predictor for the two Sydney groups.
Great, thank you. Fatima Avila says, how similar are the Bolivian musical tradition and the Papua New Guinea musical tradition? Could this have an effect when comparing among studies?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's not something that I've investigated. Yeah, but certainly worth looking at, I think.
Okay, Caroline Owen says, can you tell us more about the intervals used in the PNG music? The background clip you played to us sounded pretty close to our Aeolian mode with a central pitch very close to A440.
Wow, it sounds to me like you've got absolute pitch there. In fact, the analysis we did of the traditional indigenous music was not based on that particular recording. We analysed music from a number of villages throughout the area, and it was based on 6 pieces of music. And in fact, in only one of those examples was the set of intervals that they were using sort of reminiscent of, in fact, a sort of a pentatonic scale type structure. All of the other 5 examples had intervals that were really quite distinctly different from, this is done with a pitch analysis and looking at histograms of the intervals. All of the other 5 had intervals that were really quite distinctly different from what you would typically find in Western music. Furthermore, they were quite inconsistent with each other, except for one thing. There seemed to be a fairly common interval of around about 170 cents, you know, like a small whole tone or a very large semitone. That seemed to come up quite often between the 5 pieces. Those 5 pieces.
Okay, there's a couple more comments there on the subject of the finished. We might just move over those in the interests of time. Another question there from Kiwa Kalastian. He says, are there any findings regarding possible influences or confounders of timbre/loudness on pleasantness or perceived phrase endings? I can imagine that the sound characteristics of the used examples and stimuli also play a role in the perceived roughness.
It's possible, but in a sense, I think what we tried to do was to minimize any possible confounds in terms of the stimuli we presented by essentially presenting like chord 1 followed by chord 2, and then playing exactly the same thing but in reverse, so chord 2 and then chord 1. So the sort of between chord aspects are kind of like the same, essentially, regardless of which direction you take it in. The only thing that's changed is the temporal ordering. So that was an attempt as much as possible to make the sort of contextual information the same between the 2 things that they are choosing between. I'm not entirely sure if I've answered the question you were asking, but you gave me the opportunity to say what I wanted to say there at least.
Great, thanks Andy. Looks like most of the other questions are about sound or audio issues. So yeah, sometimes I think we will need to refresh your browser if you're having audio issues. And yeah, I think probably the person not speaking needs to mute their microphone and then remember to unmute. John McBride, this might just be our final question, I think. John has reposted his question saying, a recent review listed several different models of harmonicity. Do these results depend on the exact mathematical form of the harmonicity measure? And how is harmonicity measured directly from the audio?
Yeah, I mean, of course, that's a really good point. And of course, the results do depend on the measure of harmonicity that is used. I mean, for example, in the thing I've already talked about, taking it directly from the audio signal versus an idealized version has a large impact, but of course there are multiple ways of calculating harmonicity from an audio signal and an idealized version. So just to clarify exactly what was done here, once again, it's a process of picking the peaks from the audio signal and then using cross-correlating that with a harmonic complex tone and then choosing the maximum. That was the particular technique used here. Of course, there are other ways of doing that, and that's something that has been discussed in the literature a lot. Another concern also is that it's kind of tricky, really, because there is such a number of different ways of doing these things that I could just go through and try all of them out. But then you're kind of getting into that sort of p-hacking type behavior where you keep searching until you find something that works. I kind of think that the ways that I've calculated harmonicity and roughness directly from the audio is kind of like a fairly straightforward way of doing it. If we had more data and we were able to replicate this in other scenarios, then yes, it would be great to compare different methods.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. That was really interesting, and thank you for the all the interesting questions that have come up in the chat. Of course, if you'd like to discuss those issues a little bit more with Andy, you might want to get in touch with him. There are, as you may have noticed, several social spaces on Spatial Chat. There's a bar and a cafe where you can kind of make appointments to sit down and chat with various people if you'd like to. And I believe, somebody please post in the chat if I am wrong, but I believe that the next session on the hour are some poster sessions. So you've got a couple of minutes break, and then you'll be able to go and join some of the poster sessions in the poster rooms. And we look forward to seeing you there and to seeing you throughout the rest of the conference.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Sandra.
Thanks, Andy.